I'm Tom Baker. I come from the IQVIA consulting group. I'm based in Basel. I've been asked to facilitate a discussion today about, in particular, the reimbursement challenges, the pricing challenges, and overall the market access landscape for novel therapies, ATMPs, cell and gene therapies. I know that was a topic this morning as well, and so hopefully we won't cover the same ground, but I do think this is emerging as one of the most important topics facing this part of the industry, given the sheer cost of some of the therapies and the inability of most payers to actually fully value them in the systems that they have built for small molecules, for chronic care therapies. So today we want to dig into some of these challenges. And we have a panel today of three people who bring a lot of expertise in navigating this, both having negotiated specific access agreements in different markets, but also having commercialized products and seeing from experience what things might have been done differently and what they can share with you, what recommendations they have about how to make this work in the future. So I'm joined today by Luca Alberici, who's the Chief Business Officer at MolMed, by Etienne Jousseaume, from the Head of Market Access for Cell and Gene Therapies at Novartis, and lastly, Jason Meyenburg, Chief Commercial Officer of Orchard Therapeutics. And so we did meet by phone earlier last week just to make sure we were all kind of aligned, and so I do have some notes already that we've aligned on. But we have a few prepared questions to get us going, but we would like to encourage people in the audience to ask questions as we go. So please feel free, if you have a question, just to raise your hand and we'll make sure we get to you. So I do want to start, though, with a high-level question, and that is just with regard to the topic I alluded to, the value of these therapies. And in particular, how is it that you're able to communicate to a payer the value of a product that is essentially fundamentally different than what they're used to valuing? And we think about some of the challenges, a one-and-done therapy, a therapy that could be administered once, maybe twice, and the condition is solved. The patient's condition is no more. They're cured, or the condition is fundamentally altered. The costs can be significant, often hundreds of thousands, even over $1 million in some cases. Systems aren't set up for that. So how do you convince a payer to do this? How do you convince them of the value of a novel therapy with this kind of cost and this kind of administration requirement? I'll start with Luca.
Yeah, thank you. So I think the point is that each European country, since we are on the med here, let's try to, at least on my side, I will try to give a more European angle rather than the US based. But in every single country, you basically have two steps. One is the value definition, and the second one is definitely the price negotiation. I think, as a matter of fact, in most countries, the value definition can be applied to this kind of therapies. They all have all different models. They generally require different data set with maybe different timelines on which they can definitely calculate the value creation. But to a certain extent, the power of this kind of therapy is so much there that defining the value is generally the easier discussion that you have. The more problematic discussion is then how to then define the cost that reflects the one and off treatment rather than the chronic maintenance of the therapy. And that's where all single country have to work on their own scheme, their own budget. And so you end up with a centralized approval, a well-defined core value dossier that can prove a substantial value creation, but then how that fits into the price and reimbursement scheme is the most critical step in this discussion.
Okay. Etienne?
Yeah. So this is very new therapies for us, and this is very new therapy for the payer. And I'm working mainly on Kymriah in Europe, so I will share my experience from Kymriah. And if you do just the market access by the books, like exactly with same that for a small molecule, I mean, really by the books, the payer will tell you, I've never paid for such an expensive therapy, so by the books, I cannot give you access. So At some point, the education piece is extremely important and need to be started early. I mean, this is not a classical therapy we are bringing to market. This is ATMP, one-time treatment, potentially lifetime value, or potentially curative value. And this is something that these value messages we need to bring to the payer, of course, but much more broadly also to the administration, and that are not our natural target audience for this access, and also for the policy makers. So make sure you start early with your value messages, because it's so different that the payers will be destabilized. And if you just do things by the books, you will get to know. So start early and engage very broadly.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe just to build a bit on Etienne's comments in particular, we're finding that what we're trying to solve for here in a cell or a gene therapy is solving for a disease. So that education, we feel very strongly, starts with educating on that disease and orienting a government, a payer, different parties around that disease. Because only at that point then can we also elucidate the implications on resource utilization in the healthcare system, and with a very novel treatment approach, medicine approach, help those parties understand in that process this therapy potentially replaces so many other types of resources that the payer, the institution, the physician, other healthcare providers are involved with on a day-to-day basis, and help them see the longer-term value of really as mentioned, a lifetime therapy given with one administration. It's a journey to try to bring people through this educational process, because it's not something that's very common for us today. Hopefully it will be becoming common, the purpose for us all to be here, but to bring people along in that journey is very important.
Okay. You alluded to something important, I think, with regard to all of the other costs that may be eliminated through some of these things. At the same time, we're aware that they may impose additional costs, certainly on providers. There's a public comment period in the US, and we're seeing lots of providers comment on the additional costs that these impose on their systems and so forth. One of the complexities, of course, is that we're talking about payers as though they're one group. In fact, they're all quite different, and so we just talked about France versus Italy. There's a variety of different ones in the US, CMS, for example, but also commercial providers and payers. How do you strike the right balance between kind of an overall global value story for payers and all of the nuances that you'd need to communicate around these products, given the complexities you've outlined, for individual payers or in some cases even hospital systems?
Yeah, no, that's definitely one of the most critical aspects to consider when building your story. First, you touch upon the cost offset, and that's already something that for some indication where there is a treatment, beta thal, hemophilia, it's well characterized, but most other indications, especially rare diseases, where not always the enzymatic substitution is present, you just don't really have, it's just additional cost, as a matter of fact. But also CAR-T, tracking all the associated costs to the therapy is very challenging exercise, especially because they come from different sources and different budgets. Mm-hmm. So we try to give an overall picture to a payer of eliminating some costs that another payer is taking responsibility on. So you are basically telling a story where the entire healthcare system is better off using your therapy rather than the existing therapy. But from their perspective, where they just get charged from a piece of that, they may be disaligned with your story. And on top of that, every single country has a totally different responsibility on the budget and also timelines for budget. In most of the cases, they're reasoning on a yearly budget, whereas your therapy will actually impact several years, and that doesn't really align with what they are able to grant, to give you, just because they don't really have the system around them to come. So in our experience, for example, in MolMed, we got one product approved called Zalmoxis. And it was through a centralized approval, of course, and it was used again with phase 2 data against retrospective analysis on the EBMT that, as you heard this morning by Guido Rasi, is becoming the registry for all European cell and gene therapy. So we were very early on in this process. So we got this centralized approval with very strong clinical data, and then when we sit down to different authority, then it's where we got challenges, and we were successful, for example, in Italy and Germany. All the payers were extremely open to find a solution and very collaborative into tweaking to the maximum their own system with that clear boundaries on that. And in few countries, as I mentioned, Italy and Germany, that allowed us to get a price, a remunerative price, and getting then to the market. In some other, same like France, for example, same package of data, very similar system to Italian and Germany, to, of course, some very specific, but in that case, we were not able to get the reimbursement, really because of data, of follow-ups on details. So it's, then we have other countries that are still under negotiation, so I cannot disclose how's that moving along, but the problem is that you really have a story, you have a data package, and you get out with frustration of not being able to access several markets due to local difference and budget. So patient actually in those countries cannot access the same treatment as somebody else. It's well known that to be the case, but it still frustrates the manufacturer not to be able to access and treat patients across the entire Europe.
Okay. Etienne, what about your experience?
No, I mean, I fully agree with what Luca described. Every country has its own framework for the health technology assessment. And especially when we come to this ATMP with maybe limited data package, sometimes non-comparative and surrogate markers, then we have some HTA frameworks that works quite well for this, but some other where we find quickly blockade. So we need to adjust our strategy according to the HTA framework, and we know that in some cases it will be more difficult than in others. In some countries it will be more difficult than in others, for sure.
Okay. I think it's much the same. As I think manufacturers, we can know our therapy as well as we can know it. But I think probably the strongest advice that we would give ourselves even is be ready for feedback and embrace it. As the other two panelists have already mentioned, the therapy will be the same from one country to another, but whether it's in the structure of a country's budget or even a payer within a country, their own budget, or how one hospital may navigate administrating the therapy differently from another. We have to be ready for the feedback and understand how to make this precision medicine confidence-inspiring medicine for these institutions, hospitals and payers, physicians, and listen to how they describe their own needs and do our best to actually meet their needs. Because remember too, many of these patients, they may not be also treated locally or as locally as their own town or village or city. So there's another element of listening and feedback and really providing the most specific and high precision medicine possible and incorporating that into whatever we might call a globalized process, whether it be the treatment process, a globalized value story, but understanding that there are certain parts of that value story that are more or less important from one country to another in particular.
I like the concept of moving from precision medicine to confidence-inspiring medicine, because we say precision medicine a lot. It's almost become a term that people just throw out, right? The reality is that from a payer standpoint, the thing that they hate more than anything is uncertainty, right? They love to have confidence. If you can give them confidence, and sometimes we're hamstrung by the fact that the data packages are incomplete, they're surrogate markers, they may be a single-arm trial. There's complexities with a lot of these patient populations, and so our ability to provide confidence or certainty to a payer is a challenge. I guess what I'd be curious from all of you is what experience have you had in trying to identify which uncertainty is the problem, and what can you do to help a payer feel more confident to believe these are really precise rather than just aspirational claims? What's your recommendation for managing payers' uncertainty?
Tom, I think it's a lot of transparency. Putting fact on the table with the power of the therapies that we're here to develop and deliver. We have a great opportunity for people to be listening as well, but we can only gain credibility if we put fact on the table, if we help them understand what are the steps along the way for a patient to be evaluated first and to be treated ultimately and to be followed up. And in that process, how were they spending money previously? How would they be spending money? And there's going to be an element of growing and building confidence together because these are still fairly new therapies. So we need to recognize that we're asking a bit from the payers, but at the same time, they also have demands of us that we need to be able to meet. And I think giving them specific data is actually confidence inspiring for the payer, not just for a physician making a treatment decision.
Etienne?
So on uncertainties, really depend what kind of uncertainty they see. Is that on the long-term effect of the therapy? Is that on the way the therapy will behave in the real life and the patients will be, and the outcome of the patients? Is it on the cost effectiveness modeling and the cost themselves? So actually, it's exactly, we need to understand what are the challenges the payers see and then work with them collaboratively to solve them one by one. So in cost effectiveness modeling, we have the option to account for uncertainties, and then we can also introduce pricing models that are dependent on long-term outcome, whether in the clinical trials or in the real life, or that are dependent on the outcome, on the patient individual outcome in the real life. So we have good ways to manage that, to manage this uncertainty with the payers. And also, consider if you're still early in the process, consider early in the development process, consider meeting some of them because they can give you very good early advice on what kind of indirect comparison to prepare, what kind of validation of surrogate marker may be acceptable in this or this country. So the earlier you start, you have the opportunity to do this early engagement, then please do that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I fully agree that uncertainty is really what is at the moment scaring the payers and not allowing not always at least, the finalization of reimbursement in some countries. As a matter of fact, the payers at the end of the day needs to run a model, as all of us need to do at some point, and with the number of patients, the price per patient, and how the benefit is going to continue. So, and their concern on this kind of therapies is really along all the three axes. So, for example, in terms of number of patients, they have been in the past maybe a little bit burned by the fact that you get an approval on some indication and then you start off-label use in wide of different indication, and so they're used to work on a budget cap or some sort of limitation to limit the budget impact of this kind of therapies. Cell and gene therapies are not really that easy to use off-label and to extend indications, so that's already some concern that is a little bit off the table. Another big piece that is scaring the payers at the moment is the length of follow-up, as we keep mentioning, and in this case is where, compared to historical situation where generally the price in real-world evidence is, the data in real-world evidence is kind of decreasing compared to the clinical trial because it's more the focus, is some wider use. Here, there are even possibility where the value improves over time with substantial follow-up, where you have persistency that is even longer than expected, and therefore there is actually the opportunity to sit down and renegotiate the price north instead of south. Mm-hmm. Not sure whether that can ever happen, but still, at least there is a higher margin of maintaining the same price for a longer time. And a more specific, for example, in our product is even the number of doses, because, for example, in several other gene therapy, you have a single shot or a single transplant, and that's one. In our case, it's up to 4 infusion, and so if you then negotiate what's a single unit, in our case, is the bag of infusion, but then the patient can receive between 1 and 4, and that forces the system to negotiate the unit price, that is the bag, but that with, I would say, for example, 150K per infusion, makes the payer with an uncertainty of paying between 150 to 600,000 per patient, and that's something that we can all work on averages but averages on what? On 20, 30, 40 patients. That's not giving them sufficient confidence to bet this hundreds of thousands, and that's where then you introduce flat pricing, you some sort of share the risk with the payers. So they all have this weapon that they can try to limit the uncertainties until they don't have proof. So again, they work with budget cap, they work on flat pricing, they work with registry to monitor a little bit the use in different indication. And so this is what is currently available, and this is part of all our negotiation to date. But in the future, I think there are more structure, pan-European approach can also uniform a little bit the fact that you don't end up with a budget cap in one country and payback system in another one.
Okay. Both you and Etienne have just alluded to pricing models and some of the tools that are available to us, whether it's pay for performance or risk-sharing arrangements and so forth. We've also heard about annuity models and things where the patient or the system pays over time in order to offset the high upfront costs. What has been your experience with payer receptiveness to some of these tools? And the reason I ask is we hear a lot about, oh, these are going to solve the problem, and yet payers are saying everyone with any product now wants a special deal, and I don't have time for that. So what works, and what's your guidance for the people in the room?
I can start with this one. I mean, the right problem, the right pricing model is a model that enables the patients to have access, and that's all. So then, what does that mean for the payers? And we need to collaborate with them to understand what is their challenge on the price tag, on the cost of the therapy. Is that a budget impact issue? Is that an issue with uncertainty? Do they challenge the confirmation of the long-term outcome we promise? And in each of these cases, do they send the real-world evidence? In each of these cases, we can propose something to address the challenges. So if it's a matter of budget impact, we can discuss price-volume agreement, which are very classical. If it's a matter of, I don't believe that in the real life we'll have the same results because you selected a patient in your clinical trial, then we can go into outcome-based models. If their main challenge is about long-term effect, then we can think about conditional pricing depending on long-term outcome from the pivotal trials. So really we need to understand what is the payer concern and then build the model with him. For instance, we had a payer who said, that is something that really matters for me is I don't want to have any spike in my budget, whether a monthly spike or a yearly spike. So for this kind of payers, for sure, if this is a main concern, the annuity payments or at least installment payments will be the right one. But for this kind of payer, I mean, he may not need an outcome-based model because you will find it too complicated. So it's really important to come with a very open mind and very flexible solutions, a lot of tools available, and build the right pricing model for the patient to get access for these specific payers.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, I would just echo. I mean, I'm curious from the audience as well, because we're all learning this together in a way, pioneering together. But more or less, as Etienne said, there's sort of two categories of importance. One is around an outcome, whether that's the specific benefit or the durability of effect or questions around that, versus, let's say, fiscal needs that a payer has. And we have to be ready to not only be able to provide optionality, but to also understand that we might have to sometimes blend options together as well, based upon sort of the first issue versus the second, or a combination of the two. And it's rather, I think so far, payers are rather open, or it's fairly straightforward to understand what their needs are. It's then helping to also educate on an important point. There's a lot of conversation in our industry around long-term policy changes, and those are important. The policy we have today is largely there in support of medicines that are ones we take on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. We're talking about medicines that are very different here, where the value is delivered immediately, but potentially for a lifetime as well. And those policy changes are a medium to longer term prospect, and part of the journey or the education in listening to the payer, but also providing them options, is helping to understand, what are the immediate framework possibilities that we have, and how do we work through, changing how a price works, as Etienne mentioned, or payment over time, and even within one payer to another, even within one region to another within a country, sometimes those needs differ. So we have to really be, just as I think an earlier question, we have to really be ready to understand what's our global or even regional framework, but to really work on individual patient, hospital, and payer cases in this circumstance, one at a time.
Okay.
Yeah, I can only echo what Jousseaume is mentioning. I think, as a matter of today, there is a lot of collaboration on the way of assessing the value and making sure that what you're paying for is right for the evidence that you have at that point. What is more challenging is really what he defined more of fiscal, and it's really linked to how much the payment can go from one year into the following one, and that's where I think at the moment is the largest constraint in each single country, is really around changing. The idea is shared, and it will be probably one of the best solutions, to be mixed, of course, with the payment by performance and several others that I think the manufacturers are always ready to accept if they are sufficiently confident of the data, as they all are. But the point is really on a case by case. Maybe it's an insurance in certain countries that is willing to then, or more open or more just feasible to spread the payment across multiple years. In some others where it's really the public authorities themselves that's working on a yearly budget, it's harder to spread the payment across multiple years. And so that can go into, I hope, always hear about bringing insurance into the picture, just to ensure the more long-term and the more even distribution of payment, but that's a third parties or a super country and an entity that will act as a kind of smoother between to ensure the same structure in different countries, where in some is not available this annuity payment. And that's all very much complicated, really, because again, you have a difference from a centralized approval into a nationwide reimbursement discussion.
So as I listen to you, it seems as though it's fairly easy to diagnose some of the challenges that we face. As Etienne was saying, is it a question about the budget spike? Is it a question about the durability of effect? I mean, there's certain things that we can isolate and say that's the issue. with that being the case, is there a need for the system itself to change, or is the system doing what it's supposed to do? I mean, I think that's one of the tensions that we face here, is that we know that the system is set up to evaluate sort of the incremental benefit of a new therapy relative to what they already have. And sometimes that's hard for us for reasons we've talked about. Does that system need to change to accommodate ATMPs or novel and innovative therapies, or is it incumbent upon us to evolve what we're bringing to them?
Should I try to go first on that? So I think when we have been discussing or even hearing at panels, I think the payers are confident that the system that is in place is not optimal, but can be adapted to cell and gene therapies, ATMP in general. The evaluation of the parameters is there. They are, of course, willing to base their evaluation on a lower number of patients, on a lower follow-up, as they generally do also for other rare diseases. So their system is, in the terms of valuation of benefit, is working pretty nicely. And also UK agency, for example, initially on the evaluation of Kymriah, or not Kymriah, with the CAR-T in general, said it was our system works also for evaluating CAR-Ts, and as a matter of fact, it did to a certain extent, only to a certain extent, work for reimbursement of CAR-Ts. But again, now we're working with very limited number of products with clear benefit compared to nothing before. Now that we will assist more and more on new products coming with maybe even a lower added benefit compared to other CAR-Ts or other cell and gene therapy, I'm not sure that the benefit that you had ensured with the first wave will be maintained or implemented, and so those will be more of a challenge. I mean, the first waiver that we all represent have the challenge of education, of having the first time discussion, but even the next wave is going to be even more challenging because you already have, and then the expectation is pretty high, and so, and then you have numbers, you have serious budget constraint that at the moment none of us is really creating to any country. So that's going to be a second big step of discussion, is how to adopt not 1, 2, 3 CAR-T therapy, but 10, 20, 50.
Okay. Etienne, you said earlier that they do things by the books. Is that, do they have to change?
Yeah, they do things by the book, but then they find that their books may not work completely. So we have an initiative now from the NICE in the UK, the CADTH in Canada, and the ICER organism in the United States to review the value assessment of these cell and gene therapies. So they're seeing that they may adjust some things, and there is some danger, by the way, for the industry, because if you change, it's really not very difficult to change some parameters in this cost-effectiveness model to have a value-based price that is much lower than it is there with the current framework. So in extrapolation methods, in terms of discount rates. If you choose a high discount rate, then it can really lower very significantly your cost-effective price, because you incur the full price at infusion, at treatment, but then you discount the benefit over many years. So we need to be very careful on this kind of attempt. Horizon endpoint as well is very important, because if they start limiting the horizon to 5-10 years while we are promising a cure, then as well it can limit. There also was discussed the fact that we should not consider the cost of the current therapies that are not curative to assess the cost effectiveness. And this is definitely something we shouldn't accept. We need to have full cost-effectiveness model. So The agencies have started to react to the arrival of these cell and gene therapies, and we need to be very careful that they don't twist the framework against what is arriving on the market and what is fantastic for the patients.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, to go back again, to sort of two challenges that we face, payers face with us. As Etienne mentioned, there's definitive needs in this space to look at how to evaluate cost effectiveness of a potentially curative therapy. I mean, that sort of goes along with what we're trying to offer to patients. I think in the immediate term, it seems that payers are willing to work with us to get the effective outcome of payment terms, different way to look at risk sharing, so on and so forth. But in the long term, there need to be some fundamental changes to support doing that differently, because I think that we all are seeing the critical mass of cell and gene therapy emerge now, and certainly within the next 5 years. And it's probably not likely that using the current system to make some adaptations will support such a large number of cell and gene therapies over the next 5 to 10 year period. It's one thing to make sure that laws and regulations are there, that payers can navigate, that we can navigate and do so transparently. There is altogether another challenge that payers have as well that we need to appreciate, which is they actually then have to go operationalize a lot of these policy, law, and regulatory changes. And they're faced with sort of, I hate to say it, but a double whammy to potentially understand with us how to change these laws and regulations, and then also actually execute them and implement them. And so we're in this careful period, I think, as Etienne mentioned, how do we adapt together without making too strong a movement in one direction and unfortunately pushing a bad outcome for a 5-year period or a 10-year period or a longer period for ourselves.
Okay.
Another challenge is the way these therapies are administered, and we've seen this morning that they are targeting today very small patient populations, and so and we also need, in many cases, a lot of capabilities development to do in a single infusion center to make sure that the patients can be treated safely. That the product are treated under the correct GMO practices, that the side effects are well managed, the ordering is done properly, and so the network of treatment centers may be very limited. Sometimes 1 or 2 per country, and sometimes even in some countries, the epidemiology would not support to have one site. So we need some developments and the access, some access changes on the way the cross-regional funding works. And we know that in Europe, for instance, in Austria, in Sweden, in Spain, in Italy, it's not always straightforward. So there we need to have national fundings or compensation mechanism to account, to compensate the regions that will treat the patients from the other part of the countries. That's the first point. And then the second point is when you have a country where you don't have any treatment center because you would treat only 2 or 3 patients a year, and then it wouldn't be safe to administer the product. Then we need to have as well this cross-border compensation mechanism. And what we've seen to date is that the cross-border directive in Europe and the cross-border regulation are very clear, but they're not applied in a straightforward manner for at least the CAR-T so far. So we need definitely to advocate for better application of this cross-border regulation to be able to move the patient from place to another and for the patients to be treated properly.
I would echo that point. I mean, I think the directive is fairly clear, but from one country to another, not all countries are experienced in actually utilizing the directive. there may not be a lot of institutional knowledge developed around that. So where a patient in one market may see access fairly rapidly, in another market, another patient, the process could be very laborious, and sometimes can mean the difference between a very good outcome or delay to therapy for a patient, and unfortunately, very bad outcomes, as we know. I think too, there's a capacity topic. I think there's a very rapidly growing conversation around standardization for a number of parameters, site accreditation, transport of therapy and cells for that matter. But in addition to that, we're administering a therapy in a way that's in some ways different from how a hospital or a system has been set up. So their capacity to use our therapies is not necessarily set up for the long term for our therapies. And I think we need to take that into account and in a sense help bring along, that's a confidence topic again, I think, with the hospitals and the physicians and ultimately the payers as well, because they're not always clear about what does this mean. Do they need more bed space? Will they be using the same bed space that they already have? So on and so forth. And going back to an earlier question, Tom, you had for us, that's part of the transparency that we need to help along the way and help folks understand, will there be budget spikes or not, potentially? Are we asking them to follow a means to administer a therapy similar to what they've been doing in the past? How is it different? Or is it all very different?
Yeah. And maybe building up of what you mentioned is that understanding these challenges will allow the manufacturer and the developer to actually build a target product profile that is able to kind of circumvent some obstacle. We all know this cross-border limitation. So, for example, nowadays thinking of a fresh product formulation with maybe few centers where you can just treat the patient and having patient traveling from all over Europe or US to that centers. We know that is suboptimal. So let's try to work also on the process, on the product, in order to prevent this sort of obstacle. We know that we are working with fresh biological materials, that incoming apheresis has a huge impact on the ability then to manufacture the product and in general the characteristic of the final DP. Once again, working with the clinical centers in order then to increase the ratio of patients to be treated and ultimately also the level of payment, success-based payment that is reflected into the ability of the clinical center to actually perform what they are supposed to perform. So it's a lot of working also in robustness of the process in order then to deliver something that the payer is able to pay.
Okay. Yeah, so obviously these are very complicated and are going to present our payers with a variety of challenges. I'm conscious that we've talked for quite a bit here, and I did promise an opportunity for people to ask questions from the audience. So if anyone has any questions, do let me know, and I'm happy to take them. Yes.
Hi, thanks. I have two, actually, if I may. Yeah. Just leading on from what Jason was saying in the last part of the panel, is there agreement on what the single biggest bottleneck is, assuming that reimbursement and pricing could be dealt with, and that was no longer a problem, you had the price that you needed? Talking about things like manufacturing capability, beds, what is the other most significant bottleneck to delivering these products to patients, and is there agreement amongst the panel on that issue?
What do you think, if you had to guess?
I would say some of it is the ability to actually synchronize all of these points. Success will not occur, helping a patient transform their life will not occur if you miss any one of these points. A price has to be there, a payment term has to be there, coordination of care with an institution, supporting a family properly as well, right? I mean, we are providing an extraordinarily powerful medicine. And at the same time, we're putting a choice in front of a physician, a patient, a family for that matter, that's life-changing. and helping to make sure that there are resources and support out there so that they can make that decision properly for themselves. So you can't really miss any of these. You really have to check every single box in a very detailed fashion for every single country, region, hospital, and individual case. And I think Etienne said it probably in the first couple of minutes of the panel. So it means going out there and working through each individual situation and recognizing what is consistent from one case to another and where do you have to specialize or customize, if you will.
If I had to pick one, considering, for example, pricing reimbursement in limited access, then my other big constraints will be manufacturing, at least for autologous CAR-T, is where substantially we are still not able to face the thousands of patients per year or the tens of thousands with it's just not there, the entire capacity. On vector-wise, it's manageable, but the autologous system requires a lot of coordination, but as a matter of fact, at the end of the day, you need to kind of saturate your facility, and with the autologous, it's just not possible because the enrollment is unforeseeable, and it just cannot fit in the picture. So there is a lot of capacity being built across the globe for facing that, but still, luckily enough, at the moment, the same limitation goes hand in hand, and so one is not really limiting but we are all working on several aspects in order to making this happen. And but if we didn't have any limitation in the reimbursement at this stage, and also the clinical centers, then the biggest bottleneck will be on the manufacturing side.
I mean, I fully agree. You need first to have the patients who go to the treatment center. The treatment center has to be ready, and then the treatment center has to be able to order product, and then we have to have funding. So it's difficult to hierarchize these bottlenecks. And you also have other ones that you don't anticipate from regulatory parts. And we have some countries in Europe who absolutely need to have a sample in some storage facilities to be able to give access. So what is a sample for CAR-T therapy? That's something so you need to work with your government, with your payers, to make sure that each of these bottlenecks, you can resolve them one by one.
Second one. The second question was also just around the earlier panel. There seemed to be a reliance on these therapies are so important, there will be a way around payer and reimbursement issues. It's inevitable we will find our way around that problem. But if I look at other areas of medicine like anti-infectives and the antibiotic crisis, where the unmet medical need is understood and the challenges on a population level are pressing, we don't seem to have managed to overcome the issue of how to make sure that people like yourselves can generate value for what it is that you have available for patients. So I just wondered if you had thought about that, and if you can foresee a situation where there might actually not be an easy answer to the problem. Is that something we should be concerned about?
It's a really interesting question in light of the anti-infective situation, right? It's a market failure there, and the system is not adapted. So is there a risk here as well, that we think that there may be changes needed to come, and yet the current evidence on offer from the system is that it doesn't move that quickly? Is there a similar risk facing this part of the market?
Again, let's try to put a stick in the sand here. So it really depends on which kind of products are we talking about. So for sure, the next few years are going to be a little bit the borderlines of whether this cell and gene therapy is a little bit in a bubble or it's a reality here to stay. So depending on the market performance of Kymriah and several other autologous therapy, we will also understand a little bit whether the system is ready. For sure, it's going to be, I mean, the industry always finds solutions in the mid to long term, but in the short term, and if we are not able to generate profit in the medium term, then it's where, as a developer, need to find alternative solution. There are already a lot of allogeneic product being developed on the CAR T, really to kind of try to offset this limitation that autologous products do have. On rare diseases, the situation is slightly easier in terms of the size of the problem, in terms of the budget on the healthcare system, but also the limitation in the manufacturing is less of an issue compared to autologous CAR T. Now, also, we are facing some solid CAR T on solid indication, trying to reach advanced clinical stages, and it's putting 1 or 2 log more of problem into this current system. So we'll see. For sure, we are already developing some solution to this limitation. Now the point is whether the time of this solution will align with the changes that the current technologies require in order to make that accessible to patients. But for sure, mid-long term, we will find a nice system where cell and gene therapy will be acceptable and paid. But in the next 5 years, I'm not so sure on whether this can really be sustainable and maintained in the current setting.
Either of you?
I fully agree with you, Luca, definitely. This morning, there was this slide showing how many cell and gene therapy are arriving on the market, and there were 3 last year, 2 the day before, 3 next year. So it's not yet the booming we all expect, but in 5 years, what will it be? I hope for the patients that all the great promises will actually happen. And then the solution will not be in the payer's hand, definitely. It's not the payer who say, I will increase my budgets, my healthcare budgets by X% to afford the cell and gene therapies. It has to be a policy, a policy project. So it has to be solved at the policy level and not at the payer's level. So we need to address also with the right advocacy, the right stakeholders, and not stay only at the budget holders level, because they will not likely help us as much as we need.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, maybe the only point to add for me is, what these gene therapies represent is we're trying to build upon some of the limitations that anti-infectives and other therapies bring. They're great progress in medicine. They're interventional in a way, sometimes for an acute purpose or even a chronic purpose. For some anti-infective applications. And I think what we're trying to do right now with gene therapy is bring about a permanent change to avoid some of the sort of insidious morbidities and so on that arrive from disease. So I think it's sort of here to stay. Certainly it may grow and adapt on its own as well, and we should hope that happens. But we're probably only at the early days of bringing about a broader availability of cell and gene therapy.
Okay. We have time for maybe one more fast question, if anyone has.
Hi. It was mentioned before that in the next 5 to 10 years, there will be a critical mass of gene therapies. And it was also said that the current framework might not be able to sustain that critical mass. I was just wondering what scope there was for pricing to come down, if that could be a solution.
What do you think?
So I don't really think that there is a lot of room for negotiating just the pure upfront price. These therapies are associated with huge manufacturing costs and surrounding and development costs. So the solution cannot just be as simple as a discount on the face price. It needs to be more into allowing the same sort of value across what is accessible to the payer. But I seriously don't think that we can continue this discussion just on face price a lot longer. Otherwise, we will just kind of quit a lot of this reimbursement exercise and developing this product. So it's not just a need for the manufacturer or the state. It's really, if we need to continue changing the life of the patient, we will all together need to stop discussing the X amount of money that we have available at day X, but look at how we are generating value and pay for the value that we are generating, if that's across multiple years, if that's only for certain benefits. But again, building on what Etienne said, at the moment we are lucky enough working with the units, and therefore we still have room to negotiate just the face value. Not a big deal, although it's suboptimal, and we have time to work on alternative solution so that once these new waves come, we have this alternative solution in place that will just probably not increase the overall budget allocated to the drugs in general. Maybe, of course, the share for the regenerative therapies is going to increase and some others is going down. But it's just not the amount here, but it's how you get paid that amount.
I mean, price is in some way a single data point, and we can model price and have lots of discussions about how to best model price. But ultimately, we're still obligated to be able to describe value and to make a convincing argument around value. And I think for probably many of us who have been in biotech and sometime moved into cell and gene therapy, we continue to see in the press every day therapies that are at a very premium price. And sometimes that is tolerated, and broader access and utilization happens. And sometimes it's not tolerated. And I'd venture to say that it's tolerated when value is clear and it's clearly communicated and true. And it's not tolerated when value is not perceived to be there. So, if we want to continue to bring these great medicines to people, we need to ultimately make sure that we're bringing a very valuable therapy as well.
I think since we have reached the end of the time, that's a good note to close on, largely because the criticality of communicating that value remains central to any discussion about price or access around these therapies as it is with anything else. Maybe prices will come down over time, we don't know, but what is critical is, I think we heard today, is first to be transparent, to start early, to try to understand specifically what it is about these therapies that may challenge your customers, may challenge payers, and then to begin to articulate the value that they will get from this in terms that will mean something to them. And there's no substitute for that. So I think overall what we've heard is that everyone seems to be fairly optimistic about this. These are pretty spectacular therapies that have a profound impact on people. There are challenges. We also heard that perhaps we should be cautious about what we ask for with changes from the system because they have a way of getting out of control. But overall, the system seems to be open, and if we're good at communicating the value of these therapies, they will continue to find a place. Now, if we have 25 come in a year, maybe we'll have to rethink that. But in the near term, it seems reasonable. So with that, I would like to thank everyone for their time. Thank you very much for coming and listening to our panelists, to Jason and Etienne and to Luca. Thank you very much for your time as well, and hopefully this was valuable to you. Enjoy the rest of your time here in Barcelona.